Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our talks with Walt as we are now working through the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. We are in the inscription section and we now come to, believe it or not, poem 20 of the 24 poems of inscriptions. This one is called Still Though the One I Sing. It is a simple three-line offering, and as I said in our discussion of What Place is Besieged, it's compelling the ways in which in these final poems of inscriptions, Whitman is able to say so much with so little and do so much with so little. Notice the strange, odd phrasing of still though the one I sing. We'll obviously get to it in a bit as we're going to say out loud that Whitman is always playing around with syntax or with wording, and we're going to see that as we work through Leaves of Grass. Now, there are some assumptions that I'm hoping are accurate here as I begin the discussion of this poem. First of all, learnstrong.net. If you haven't been following our stuff, down the left-hand side there, I hope that you can find the folder that says Talks with Walt, and you're able to see the earlier discussions that we're messing around with. We love to point out, and Whitman, of course, teaches us in 303 this idea that we really are the stories that we will tell and retell, both individually as well as a nation. We are also the stories, of course, that we decide to accept or reject. Some of that rejection we're going to obviously hear even in this poem. Our learning theory we have to remind ourselves of. Always we're looking to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. Again, we're always challenging ourselves to accept that the new NEW is the KNEW new. Our annotative approach will ask three guiding questions. What does the text say? Level 1, text mean. Level 2, and then at level 3, how can it relate to this information in some meaningful way? We'll ask about our big five always with every text. What does the text say about epistemology? What you can know. Ontology, who you are. Psychology, study of individual mind. Sociology, study of the collective mind. We're going to hear a lot about that in this poem. And then finally, of course, the question of theodicy. Can we find some value in the pain and in the suffering? We're going to hear a lot of that in this as well. Finally, we'll look at Whitman from 5 perspectives. Whitman as person, Whitman as poet, Whitman as pedagogue or teacher, Whitman as politician and his love of democracy, a whole lot about that here, and Whitman as philosopher. Let's turn now to some background information to just make sure that we feel confident with what it is that we're playing around with here. Still, though the one I sing, this was actually the introductory poem and the only new one of a group of 6 labeled Songs of Insurrection, which Whitman arranged for the 1871-1876 editions and then became one of the inscriptions in 1881. Now let's turn to the poem itself and let's enjoy his use of some of the odd syntax or verbiage. And notice the power of the one, right? Now for the Matrix fans in the house, you know all about Neo constantly being called the one. And we're gonna hear this one in this game that we're gonna play. The other thing I want to set you up for it to be is notice the use of the parenthetics. We're gonna see it a couple of times here, and as well the exclamation points. Still though the one I sing. Still though the one I sing, one yet of contradictions made, I dedicate to nationality. I leave in him revolt. Oh, latent rite of insurrection. Oh, quenchless, indispensable fire. One of the things I love about Whitman is the way that he can create a certain kind of energy with some very few words, and this obviously is an important element in our reading of Leaves of Grass. We'll begin, notice, with the arcane language, still though the one I sing. I still sing though, I still sing the one though. Notice the construction is a strange one though. Notice he begins with the word still, immediately makes us think about T.S. Eliot's East Coker, old men ought to be explorers, we must be still and still moving, and this idea of still is an interesting word. I think T.S. Eliot learned to use the word still from his study of not just the French symbolists like Baudelaire, but as well Walt Whitman himself. This word still is a fascinating word because it carries with it this notion of, at the same time, stillness, as well as somehow perpetuating, as in I still want to do this. Notice we're back to singing again as well. If Leaves of Grass inscription tells us anything, it tells us that these poems of Leaves of Grass are going to be chants, songs, music, and obviously meant to be read out loud. Notice right away, though, he has to qualify the one that he's singing, and so he uses the parenthetic with the use of the word one again. One yet of contradictions made. And immediately we recognize he's playing a twofold game. He's talking about America as being constructed of contradictions, and obviously Leaves of Grass as well. They are one and the same. So we're going to meet with all of these strange paradoxes. We're going to meet with all these strange kind of conundrums, and we're going to feel okay with that as we work through Leaves of Grass. In the same way that we look at American history, and clearly all kinds of contradictions. No question. And as we've said many times in 303, we don't want to run from those contradictions. Yes, it is true that the author of the Declaration of Independence, who said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That same writer owned slaves. Yes, that is a contradiction. But America is full of contradictions, and Whitman is going to say we don't run from those. We embrace those, and we have to come to terms with those, right? Our study, obviously, of Frederick Douglass, among any number of other thinkers, is one way of doing that. One yet of contradictions made is the first parenthetic, and then he's back to it. I dedicate. Now this word dedicate is a fascinating verb, isn't it? Because it can serve both as noun as well as verb very, very quickly. To dedicate, to promise, to try to achieve. I dedicate to, notice it's capitalized, nationality. It will be the song, that is to say, of this collection of poems, will be the song that we would later call the national anthem. Now, of course, the Star-Spangled Banner is the national anthem of America, but many of us will argue that the true national anthem of America is, in fact, Leaves of Grass. I mean, if you really want to understand what America is and who America is from its inception, by inception here, obviously, we're talking about, for Whitman, that important time when America was actually born, that is to say, the Great Civil War. It's all about nationality, right? And the ways in which he will understand that term. Notice, I dedicate to nationality, I leave in him, again, this him, the masculine, the one, the nation, maybe even Leaves of Grass, revolt. And we're back to this language again from earlier, right, into the states, resist much, obey little, right? Revolution. Like Thoreau, Whitman is very much in that school of thought that says sometimes there has to be a revolt, there has to be a revolution, or certainly reform or reformation, right? And then again we've got the parenthetics with the use of the word "o." Twice used, we're going to see this often in Leaves of Grass, "O latent right of insurrection." Now, the word latent is an interesting word, right? Because it's, of course, something there, but something not there in its potentiality. And again, we've said this in a number of lectures already in the Inscriptions poems. This idea of the potentiality of both his poem as well as the nation itself. Notice the use of the word right has to make us think of Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. And then that important word, insurrection. That is to say, like Thoreau, we immediately think of civil disobedience, the famous essay. We've given lectures on it at learnstrong.net. There has to be in a democracy the spirit of not just obedience and conformity, but as we learn in our Emerson study of self-reliance, insurrection. He who would be a man must be a nonconformist. Here we're playing around with this notion of insurrection. And then please note for 2A or for 2B, the exclamation point, right? We'll pay attention, right, to the ways in which Whitman uses that exclamation point throughout Leaves of Grass. And then a second O, it's a second thought, quenchless, indispensable fire, exclamation point, close parenthetic for the end of this poem. Notice again the use of the repetition of the word O. It's a useful word. It will be like lo, the word that we saw in What Place is Besieged in a number of other earlier poems in Inscriptions. Quenchless. Obviously here we're talking about something never-ending. This will be huge as a theme in Leaves of Grass. And then indispensable fire. So you have stacking of adjectives here in quenchless and indispensable, separated by the comma, and then notice the exclamation point at the conclusion. Now the fact that he talks about indispensable, that is to say, you can't get away from it. We gotta have it, right? makes us think about Thoreau's Walden, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately to front only the essential facts, right? That is to say, the indispensable, the stuff that really matters. Whitman's constantly in Leaves of Grass challenging you to think about what really matters, what is indispensable. Now, the fact that we begin this poem with Still Though the One I Sing and contradictions and finish with the word fire will put us, obviously, with what place is besieged, and obviously the whole notion of that ever-fired gun. So notice in both of the two poems that we're working with here, What Place is Besieged and Still Though the One I Sing, will elicit this notion of fire, an important symbol in Leaves of Grass, and we have to think about our Egyptian mythology and obviously the phoenix itself, that bird which will bury itself in its arcane age and then will burst into flames to become a new young bird again. Whitman loved that word picture. He loved that metaphor, and he's always playing around with it. Of course, the exclamation point to tell us how seriously committed in terms of tone he is to the ideas of insurrection, of contradictions. Let's jump to 2A quickly. Well, obviously, the quest for political freedom is a never-ending quest. This is one of the things that Whitman will say to every time, every generation of American readers, and obviously world international readers as well. To find the next great way to live requires it be a never-ending search, right? It's not like we're going to find some panacea and there we are living in that no. It is the quest. It's never-ending. Of course, as well, another 2A message here is that poets remind us of our right of insurrection and the contradictions that will define that in such profound ways. Instead of running from those, we must embrace those and obviously transcend and include them. At 2B, well, obviously we noticed the somewhat odd syntax, right? It does kind of slow the reader's eye, and it makes you kind of go, wait, what's he saying? Wait, what's he saying? Notice as well the use of the parenthetics twice, the 2 times the exclamation point is used. I like to point out as we began our study of Leaves of Grass together that Whitman is a scrapper. He's a singer, but he's a scrapper. And this use of the exclamation points, the tone is one of scrapper. That is to say, let's fight. But at the same time, and this is obviously one of the great contradictions of Leaves of Grass, he's not only a scrapper, he wants us fighting, but he wants us unified as well. This is amazing, right? Those paradoxes. At 3A, I've already mentioned the Declaration of Independence, right? That is to say, let facts be submitted to a candid world, a watching world, why it is the case that we must do what we must do, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary. Go back to that lecture on the DOI that I've given at learnstrong.net. The fact that Jefferson wanted to make the argument, we don't have a choice. We do not have a choice. We have to do the things we have to do. You'll sense that tone in this poem as well. Obviously, our Homer and our Virgil, think about it. Those heroes, Achilles, Aeneas, they are Odysseus. They are fundamentally heroes of contradiction, right? I mean, there is Achilles sitting in his tent in Iliad 9, strumming away, singing songs about old warriors. You can't imagine that he's going to later in that poem slaughter so many people. Those contradictions, however, have to be understood. And I think that this is one of the things that makes the great texts so valuable for us. Notice again, our Dante. You don't go to hell, you go through hell if you're Dante, and that's significant in our reading as well of Leaves of Grass. Of course, we have to think about Thoreau. I was going to say Thoreau and Emerson, but let's just concentrate on Thoreau for now, right? I mean, obviously, he learned from his teacher, Emerson, from a text like Self-Reliance, the value of contradictions, the value of insurrection. And of course, think about it, those lines. Before the lines that I quoted from Walden, I went to the woods because I wish to live deliberately, he says, we must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn that will not forsake us in our darkest hours. He says it. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability for a man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. That conscious endeavor here obviously being referenced in this text as well, right? That is to say for Thoreau, civil disobedience. That government is best, which governs not at all, he will say at the beginning of that classic essay. We've given a full lecture as well there. Finally at 3B, how am I going to own a text like this? Well, how about this one? What is your quenchless, indispensable fire? I would write that down on a sheet of paper. I would put it next to some place where I look all the time. What is my quenchless indispensable fire? What is that for you? What is it that keeps you going? Some of us maybe will say study of texts, study of stories, sharing of stories is in fact that. Most humanists will play that game usually out, and they'll say, I gotta be honest, it's those texts that I love to talk about, it's the stories that I love to share that somehow help me find what my quenchless, indispensable fire is. How about this one? If we are contradictions, and we certainly are as a nation, we certainly are as people, then what is your favorite contradiction? What is your favorite contradiction? And I hope that as we get into Whitman himself as poet and as person, we'll recognize some of his favorite contradictions as well. Thank you. I hope that you're enjoying our contradictions.